So architects demand a high rate. So historically, that's been something where people say, I can't afford an architect. I don't need an architect. I would argue you can't afford not to have an architect. And now the fractional architect model makes it much more feasible for orgs of any size to bring in the architect skills they need.
So Salesforce has launched Well Architected because they understand the importance of architecture up front. So, Brian, how are you seeing that in customers?
The Salesforce well architected framework that was launched, I believe, last year, 2022. There's kind of three main pillars or three main dimensions: trusted, easy, and adaptable. So, trusted, is it secure? Is there predictable uptime? Is it something that users can rely on? Is it easy? Is it easy to use? Is it human centered? From an application perspective, is it adaptable? Is it something that is scalable? Is it something that when the next project comes along and we need to change it, is it changeable? So this framework, like I mentioned, I'm a big fan of the framework. I know you are too, Ian. And when we're getting into any kind of a complex org, or we're getting into any kind of a complex project, an architect is really the one playing the role of ensuring that all three of those dimensions are being addressed, right? And that skill set is a really important skill set, but it's not a skill set that for many organizations it's not something they need 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, and it's not a skill set. Some of them can't afford that, and they don't need it. So it's something that that's where the fractional architect role comes in.
Brian Shea is 13 times Salesforce certified. He's a fractional Salesforce architect and the founder of Shea Consulting. And they've been a consulting partner for the last 3 years. He's been building CRM systems for 20 years, 10 years of that on the Salesforce platform. So when he's working with clients, he focuses on Salesforce system architecture, road mapping, scoping and leading client RFPs, and obviously coaching them through the whole principles of Well Architected. For many people, fractional architect is a term they've never heard of. So can you describe to me what a fractional architect would be?
Sure. So a fractional everything has become more and more popular. Fractional chief marketing officers, fractional CIOs. So fractional architect is somebody who comes in and is not a full-time employee, obviously, and they're not a full-time contractor or consultant. But I'd say one of the things that a good fractional architect brings to the mix is very clear deliverables and very clear roles that they're playing to really maximize your investment in them on a project. So it should be very clear with fractionals what you're going to provide, what are the inputs to their work, and what are the outputs to their work.
So that suggests to me that that's in the project plan. There are specific pieces of work they're doing at a period of time. So it's not a call-off contract. Every time we're in trouble, we'll call you. But actually, there's specific stuff up front at the time when it will have the biggest impact, which is let's make some sensible architectural decisions now, which are, rather than leaving them till the end, and then it's actually too difficult and too expensive to reverse
100%.
engineer.
And what you just hit on there is what I mentioned before about being really clear about what the inputs to their work is and what the deliverables from their work. So to take your example of a project with where we want to do the architecture, a good job architecting up front, you could see if in our organization we have a process where we do requirements, and let's say one of our deliverables from requirements is a UPN diagram or a series of UPN diagrams, right? You could say like, okay, we produce the UPN diagram as one of our requirements deliverables, and then we do sort of a design and architecture phase where we identify the particular Salesforce features, and we do a design document with a data model and a logical data flow and different deliverables. And then once that design document is complete, let's say we're handing it off to a development team to deliver it. In that model, right, the requirements stage could be an input to the design stage, with which the architect that's where they're really going to be playing. And then you've got a build phase where maybe the architect is involved on like a weekly call, right? Maybe they're not completely out, but they're involved with, because as you know, when you're building, architecture considerations and requirements considerations come up, right? Where there's trade-offs that need to be made. So maybe the architect's involved with that, and maybe they're involved in a final sort of architecture review at the end of the build. But you see there where there's very clear spots in the process where the architect is involved, and there's spots where they're not going to be involved. And that's really where some of the power of this role comes in, as opposed to just kind of having a staff augmentation architect where they're just sort of involved with the whole thing, right?
So that means, I mean, an architect is an expensive resource because quite reasonably they're highly talented. You've spent a long time
Yep.
gaining those skills. So it's making sure as a customer, you're actually using those skills to the max at the
Yep.
points when they're needed and not having them hanging around in case there's a question that needs to be
Absolutely. Yeah,
asked.
and I think one of the things we should state it explicitly, like one of the things, if you're going to bring in a true fractional architect, it's really important to kind of have your development process defined, right? And to be very clear about that with the architect, so you're clear with where the handoffs are, and you're very clear with what the deliverables are that you're going to give to the architect and what the architect's going to give back to you.
This idea of fractional ownership, fractional architects, is that as well established in the Salesforce ecosystem, or are we still making this up?
We're still making this up, definitely. We're definitely still making it up. I think I've been surprised in the last 6 months how, in the past, I used to say fractional architect and people would say, "What's that?" But now I think people are familiar with kind of the fractional CXO, like the fractional chief marketing officer, the fractional CIO. So now when you say fractional architect, even if they hadn't heard it in terms of architecture, people kind of get the high level concept. But it's still early days.
One of the things you said earlier was you need a well-defined development process. If you haven't got that well-defined, then you're not going to get the benefits out of fractional ownership in the same way. So I think you as a consultant, maybe you're there helping them set that structure at the same time.
100%. 100%. Yeah, it's I have, and it's not to say they're not out there, but like I said, in the last 6 months, I see people who are more familiar with the term, like at a high level. But there's definitely communication that needs to happen in terms of what does this actually look like? Because I think the biggest misconception that I see is people are saying, "Oh, so you're a fractional architect? That means you're going to work 25 hours a week for us," which is, there's nothing wrong with that model, but I'd say that's more of like a contractor model, right? You're going to come in, you know, as an architect, and we're going to kind of tell you what to do and what needs to be done. The fractional architect there's a little bit more of a consultative advisory thing. There's very particular deliverables that are coming out of it. And I'd say in general, you're with the fractional architect role, I would argue you're getting kind of more bang for your buck because you're getting very, very targeted things, and it's not just about sort of number of billable hours.
So are we getting to the point where you can almost fix price some of those chunks of work, or is it?
It depends on the chunks of work. So I'll say, like, I would say for me as a fractional architect, when we're talking about kind of the project work that we just talked about, I would still personally do it hourly. Because I think there's uncertainty around the complexity of the org and things like that. But when I'm looking at some of the other types of engagements too, road mapping, business case. Sometimes I'll get hired kind of as a fractional architect to help the company build a business case, and that's something where I'd be much more comfortable doing fixed cost. But I'd say still, generally for me personally, and I think this is a lot of people kind of in the architecture space, independents, probably still more comfortable doing hourly than fixed cost.
I think fixed price is very difficult, as you said, if you don't understand the complexity of the org. But there's a difference between going, it's fixed price, it will cost you, I know, $10,000 to do X, versus at the opposite end, okay, I'll just turn up and my hourly rate is. This feels like we're actually closer to, okay, there's a set scope of what you're expecting. At this point, we'll do this. This is the boundaries of what it's going to be. Obviously, it's time and materials because we don't know what we're going to get into, but at least we understand what the deliverables are. So we've got fixed deliverables, which is a long way from the I'll just turn up and you ask me anything type model of time and materials.
100%. Yeah, and what you just described, and again, this isn't necessarily a criticism of this model, but what you described, I would call the contractor model, which is 25 hours a week for 6 months. And what are you getting? You're getting 25 hours a week for 6 months. You don't there's there's nothing else to it. And you can get a lot of value out of that, but there's the danger that that 6 months goes by and what you had in mind isn't necessarily what you're going to get.
But that also, okay, if I'm the customer, I need to understand with this new model what I need to do at certain phases. So
Mm-hmm.
I know that at certain phase X, I shouldn't move forward from this phase unless I've got a set of architectural deliverables. Now,
Yep.
I think that's probably where the immaturity is in terms of understanding what those deliverables are at certain points. And if you
Yep.
can coach a customer into what they should be buying, then they can buy it in the way that makes most sense to them.
Yeah, I think one of the things, 100%, and I think one of the things from my perspective as a fractional architect that I've got to be um, really clear on, and what I hope I get clarity from the client on is, everybody says they do requirements, and everybody says they do requirements well. But as you know, there's a huge qualitative difference between good requirements and not good requirements. So a lot of times, what I need to do in kind of my sales discovery piece is get a sense of their maturity in terms of, for example, producing a requirements doc, right? Like, is it, I used UPN as an example, do they have skills doing like UPN diagramming, or is that going to be a useful deliverable, or is it going to be something that's much more of just a starting point, and we're going to need to work on the requirements together, right? And that's something where again, I've got to be try to be as clear as possible with them about kind of where I think their maturity is and what I need as an input and what I can expect to get them from as an input.
It feels like we're in the early stages of fractional architects where you're having to define how you would buy that service. I think if we roll the clock forward maybe 1, 2, 3 years, it will be well understood. And then suddenly everyone's going, oh, yeah, we have a well-defined development process. We need to plug an architect in here in these places. And I think that level of maturity means that more and more people will start to get the benefits of having an architect rather than say, the default reaction is, I can't afford one. Let's just, oh, you're an admin. Can you do it? Which is clearly, you're setting yourself
Right.
up for maybe failure long term. So I think the more we can get people understanding that this is an affordable resource because it's fractional
Yep.
and it's a
Yep.
manageable cost,
Yep.
that then it's worth doing. And then the trick
Right.
is we're trying to get people to do it as early as possible in the cycle.
Yep. And I think, as a consultant and as a business owner, and I'm sure this will resonate with you, we're also, when we're talking about value, a lot of times we're comparing it to how they'd spend that dollar somewhere else, right? And what you see is you can spend a relatively small amount of money up front with a fractional architect, or you can spend a lot of money either redoing a project or having a project go much longer in scope or having a project that it doesn't really deliver the value that it promised to. And I think that's a that's something that the right kinds of clients get, right? Not everybody's going to get that, but I think organizations that have done this kind of work in terms of developing effective systems and Salesforce, and they understand the value of this, even if the fractional architect type thing is a relatively new model for them.
But do you think how much energy Salesforce is putting behind well architected? So I think that message is now
Yeah.
being driven into every org, every customer saying architecture is really important. It's important to do it up front. The whole message of,
Yep.
oh, just use Salesforce, build an object, off you go. I think that message is now being pushed to the back, and do the architecture up front. That's great. Now that the
Yep.
customers are now saying that's great, but I can't afford it. I think we've now got the next piece, which is fractional architect means I can afford to do it at the right times. So the next piece in the
Absolutely.
maturity is going, if I understand well architect is important, and I understand that fractional architects are available, okay, now how do I
Yep.
purchase it? Because I've
Yep.
never bought one of these things before, so how do I do it? Because I'm uncomfortable about doing that. So I think maybe a little bit of work. Maybe we should be leaning on Salesforce to talk about what fractional architect means and
Right.
the right times to go and purchase it, so we can start to get that awareness of how to buy the service and get the benefits from it. We've talked about fractional architects being a good idea, but can you try and put some idea about where the value is or how much the savings are for doing this piece of work up front?
Sure. Yeah. So, if we just take it in terms of rough numbers, you could see on a project spending somewhere around 5% of the total budget of the project on a fractional architect. That's going to depend on the skill set of your team coming into it, but let's say 5%. The cost of needing to redo a significant portion of that project, the cost of the timeline going 6 months over, the cost of a suboptimal experience where you need to redo the UI or redo the security model or redo the data model. I mean, these are things where you could be doubling the cost of your project over the course of a number of years, over the course of total cost of ownership.
It's way more than that. If you think about all the stuff around shift left, they talk about it being 100 times more expensive when
Really?
trying to fix it in production. Oh yeah, I mean the numbers are dramatic. But the problem is you never re-engineer it, and then you live with that pain
Right.
forever. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine who was head of digital banking for one of the big banks,
Yeah.
and I said, I've just put my change of address in, and it says it takes 7 days to update. And I went, well, why does it do that? He said, oh, you don't realize we have 350 CRMs. Every time we buy a bank,
Yeah.
we're like, we should integrate this, and we go, that's too hard, and they've just put a layer on top, beautifully architected, but all of that behind the scenes is just constant technical debt which you've never fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they're a huge bank. They've been around forever, so therefore you expect that. But actually, if you're building a new project, let's not build that in up front. Let's do the architecture correctly, so we never have all that technical debt that rolls through.
Yeah, and when you put it in those terms, like 5 or 10% upfront versus, I said 2x, you said 100x. Let's split the difference and say 50x. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that again, that's why Salesforce is investing so much in the well-architected program. I think what we've just done now is, with this idea of fractional architect, we've unlocked how that can be possible for an org of any size.
Yes. Yes.
Before, people went, well architected, we're not a big org, we've only got a couple of admins, we can't possibly do that. And the answer is, number one, you absolutely must do that, and number two, now there's an affordable way of doing that. It's called fractional architect. You now need to start thinking about how you would apply that to your particular projects.
Yep. Absolutely.
This has been fantastic, Brian. So if I wanted to learn more about well architected, more about fractional architects, where would I go?
Okay, so in order to learn more about well architected, you should go to the Salesforce Architects blog. If you just Google Salesforce well architected, it'll be the first result. In terms of fractional architecture, there's not a ton out there. At the moment, we're working with the Architect Evangelist group to kind of get some stuff out there. Not a ton out there right now, but definitely more to come.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brian. It's been a fascinating conversation. For everyone else who's been listening, make sure you subscribe down there, up there, wherever. Hit the subscribe button to make sure that you're notified for the next Experts React session.